Some losses cut so deep they change who you are forever. When Pearl Brewster watched 43 years of memories disappear in 20 minutes of wind, she thought her world had ended. The tornado left nothing but broken wood and shattered dreams across their Kansas homestead. Franklin held his wife close as they stood in the wreckage, both of them too old to start over, too proud to ask for help. That's when a stranger rode up on horseback, leading a pack mule. Josiah Cordell was a mountain man who hadn't talked to people in years. He'd lost everything once too. What he did for this broken couple changed all their lives. He didn't just help them rebuild their house, he gave them something much more precious than shelter. But could three strangers really become a family in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light fell across the Kansas plains like a benediction, but there was no blessing in what it revealed. Pearl Brewster stood where her kitchen window used to be, her weathered hands clutching a simple gold band that had never left her finger in 43 years of marriage. The wedding ring caught the early sun, a tiny circle of promise amid the devastation that stretched as far as she could see. Franklin's carpenter tools lay scattered among the debris, his leather belt split open, chisels buried in mud. The hand plane their son had given him for Christmas cracked clean through. Those tools had built this house board by board, nail by nail, in the summer of 1881, when they were young and foolish enough to believe love could conquer anything the prairie threw at them. "Pearl, honey, come away from there." Franklin's voice carried the weight of 6 decades, though his frame still held the solid strength of a man who'd worked with his hands his entire life. His grey hair stuck up at odd angles, and his flannel shirt bore tears from pulling debris off what used to be their front porch. "Standing there won't bring it back." She turned to him, this man who'd been her anchor through 4 decades of prairie life, through droughts and good harvests, through the birth of their children, and the slow ache of watching them grow up and move to distant cities. His blue eyes, still sharp despite the web of lines that framed them, held the same devastation she felt in her own heart. "I know," she whispered. "I just keep thinking if I look hard enough, I'll find something else, something we can save." The tornado had come from the southwest, a black finger of God's wrath that touched down near Hutchinson and carved a path of destruction 30 miles long. 20 minutes of howling wind had undone a lifetime of careful building. Their barn was gone completely, scattered in pieces across 3 counties. The house, their beautiful house with its wraparound porch and the climbing roses Pearl had nursed for 15 years, was nothing but a foundation and a few standing walls that leaned at dangerous angles. Neighbors had come yesterday, as neighbors do, bringing blankets and hot coffee and the kind of quiet sympathy that prairie folks offer in times of trouble. The Hendersons from 2 miles east had lost their chicken coop but little else. The Millers to the north had damage to their roof, but their house still stood. The Brewsters had taken the worst of it, caught directly in the tornado's path with nowhere to run and no time to do anything but huddle in their root cellar and pray. "We could stay with the Millers," Franklin said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Martha said there's room in their attic space." Pearl shook her head. At 67, she was too old to be anybody's houseguest, too proud to accept charity that felt like pity. "This is our land, Franklin, our home. We'll figure something out." But even as she said it, the practical part of her mind, the part that had managed a household budget through lean years and calculated feed costs and planned every meal for 4 decades, was adding up the impossibilities. They had some savings, but not enough to rebuild from nothing. Their children lived hundreds of miles away. Robert in Chicago, with his law practice. Sarah in Denver, with her doctor husband. Both had families of their own, responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned to help 2 old folks who should have been practical enough to move to town years ago. The sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. A lone rider was approaching from the west, moving at an easy pace across the grass that the wind had pressed flat as a carpet. He sat his horse like a man accustomed to long distances, comfortable in the saddle, in a way that spoke of years spent traveling. Behind him, a pack mule followed on a lead rope, loaded with supplies that suggested he'd been on the trail for some time. As he drew closer, Pearl could make out more details. He was tall and lean, probably in his 50s, with hair the color of steel wool beneath a worn hat. His clothes were practical leather coat despite the warmth of the morning, canvas trousers, boots that had seen hard use. But it was his face that caught her attention. It was a face that had seen weather and hardship, marked by lines that spoke of squinting into distant horizons and enduring long silences. The rider stopped his horse 20 feet away and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, folks. Name's Josiah Cordell." His voice was rough, like a man who didn't use it often. "Saw the damage from the ridge. Thought I'd see if you needed anything." Franklin stepped forward, his carpenter's eye automatically assessing this stranger. "Franklin Brewster. This is my wife, Pearl. We appreciate you stopping, but we'll manage." Josiah's dark eyes moved over the destruction with the methodical attention of someone who understood building and what it meant to lose everything. Pearl watched his face and saw something she recognized, the careful distance of someone who'd learned not to get too involved in other people's troubles. "Tornado?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yesterday evening," Pearl said, "came through around supper time. We were lucky to get to the root cellar in time." Josiah nodded and dismounted, his movements economical and sure. Up close, Pearl could see the quality of his gear, everything well made and carefully maintained, the tools of a man who lived far from stores and repair shops. "Mind if I take a look around? I've seen my share of storm damage." Franklin's pride bristled visibly. "We don't need any help, mister. We'll sort this out ourselves." But Pearl found herself saying, "Look all you want. There's not much left to see." Josiah walked through the debris with the careful step of someone reading sign. He knelt beside a pile of lumber that had once been their dining room wall, running his hands over the wood, testing joints that had held for 20 years until the wind found them wanting. He examined the foundation, walking its perimeter like a man surveying property he intended to buy. "Good foundation," he said finally. "Stone and mortar work solid. Most of the lumber's salvageable if you clean it up right." He straightened and looked directly at Franklin. "You do the original carpentry work?" Despite himself, Franklin's chest puffed slightly with pride. "Every board and nail. Took me 3 summers, working after harvest season." "Good work," Josiah said simply. "Shows in the joinery. Takes skill to build something that lasts this long out here." It was exactly the right thing to say. Pearl watched her husband's shoulders relax slightly, the defensive tension easing. Praise from another craftsman carried weight that sympathy never could. "Where you heading?" Franklin asked, curiosity overcoming caution. Josiah gestured vaguely toward the mountains, visible as a blue line on the western horizon. "Nowhere particular. Been living up in Colorado, but the winters are getting harder every year. Thought I'd see some different country." "You traveling alone?" Pearl asked, though she already knew the answer. This was a man accustomed to solitude, carrying it around him like his well-worn coat. "For quite a while now," Josiah said quietly, and something in his tone suggested depths he didn't intend to reveal. They stood in awkward silence, 3 strangers brought together by circumstance and disaster. Pearl could feel the weight of decisions pressing down on them: where to sleep tonight, what to do with the debris, how to begin the impossible task of rebuilding. At their age, with their resources, it felt overwhelming. "I've got supplies," Josiah said suddenly. "Coffee, bacon, beans. Been on the trail for 2 weeks and I'm tired of my own cooking. If you folks don't mind the company, I'll share what I've got in exchange for a hot meal cooked by someone who knows what they're doing." Pearl felt her heart lift slightly. A practical offer, one that didn't sound like charity. "That's kind of you. We can set up something in what's left of the kitchen area. The stove's buried, but I can build a cook fire." Franklin looked like he wanted to object, but practical necessity won out over pride. They needed food, and their supplies were either buried in the wreckage or spoiled by the rain that had followed the storm. As Josiah unpacked his mule, Pearl noticed how carefully he handled everything. His gear was arranged with the precision of someone who'd learned that disorganization could mean the difference between comfort and misery, between safety and danger. She found herself wondering what had driven a man to live so carefully alone, what losses had taught him to be so self-sufficient. While she cooked over the fire Josiah built with expert efficiency, she listened to the two men talk. Franklin, starved for adult male conversation after months of seeing only his wife and the occasional neighbor, began to open up about the challenges of farming and building in this unforgiving country. Josiah listened more than he spoke, but when he did contribute to the conversation, his comments showed deep, practical knowledge. "The wind's the thing," Franklin was saying as they ate beans and bacon off tin plates. "You can plan for drought, even for hail, but when the wind gets up like that, there's nothing for it but to hunker down and hope. Mountains have their own weather troubles," Josiah said, "but you're right about the wind. Out here, it's got room to build up force." He paused, looking around at the devastation. "But the foundation's good, and you know how to build. That's more than most folks have to start with." As the sun moved higher, burning off the morning coolness, Pearl found herself watching this stranger who'd appeared like something out of a folk tale. There was kindness in him, she sensed, buried under layers of caution and self-protection. But there was also loneliness, the kind that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person. "How long since you've been around people?" she asked suddenly. Josiah's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "Been a while. Must get lonely up in those mountains." For a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped, and she saw raw pain flash across his features. Sometimes lonely's easier than the alternative. Pearl understood. She'd seen that look before, in the faces of men who'd come back from the war changed, in women who'd lost children, in anyone who'd learned that loving something meant risking everything. This man had loved deeply once, and lost completely. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. The practical part of her began to calculate. A man alone, with supplies and obvious skills. A couple who needed help but couldn't afford to hire it. It might be a solution that served everyone's needs, if pride and fear could be managed carefully. "Mr. Cordell," she said slowly, "how long were you planning to stay in this area?" Josiah's eyes sharpened, sensing the weight behind her casual question. "Hadn't made any firm plans? Why do you ask?" Franklin was looking at her with the expression he wore when she was thinking through a problem he couldn't quite see. After 43 years of marriage, he knew better than to interrupt when she had that particular look. "Well," Pearl said carefully, "it seems to me that we've got a situation here. Franklin and I need to clear this debris and figure out what to do next. You're traveling alone and probably tired of your own company. Maybe we could work out something that helps everybody." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge half-built, waiting to see if anyone was brave enough to cross it. Josiah was quiet for so long that Pearl wondered if she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "What did you have in mind?" "Stay a few days," she said. "Help us sort through this mess and see what's salvageable. In exchange, we'll feed you proper meals, and you'll have people to talk to. No obligations beyond that." Franklin's eyebrows rose, but he didn't object. He was practical enough to recognize help when it was offered, even if his pride had to swallow hard to accept it. Josiah studied them both with those dark, measuring eyes. Pearl could almost see him weighing the risks of involvement against the pull of human connection. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Few days," he agreed. "See what there is to see." As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the Kansas plains, three strangers began the delicate work of learning to trust each other. None of them knew it yet, but that simple agreement would change all their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The full scope of their loss didn't truly hit until the second morning, when the sun rose clear and merciless over what had once been home. Pearl stood in the spot where her kitchen table had sat for 20 years, holding a cracked daguerreotype she'd found buried under a pile of sodden lumber. The image showed a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, standing beside a bearded man who held a small child. She'd never seen the photograph before. It must have fallen from Josiah's coat when he'd hung it on the fence post the night before. "That yours?" Josiah's voice came from behind her, quiet but tense. She turned and held out the photograph, watching as his weathered hands took it with infinite care. His fingers traced the crack that ran through the woman's face, and Pearl saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "My wife, Catherine," he said simply. "My daughter, Anna, taken in Denver, 1878. Pearl waited, sensing there was more, but Josiah's face had closed again like a door slamming shut. He slipped the photograph back into his coat pocket and turned away, but not before she caught the flash of raw grief that crossed his features. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I didn't mean to pry. No harm done." But his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully controlled. Franklin emerged from what had been their bedroom, his face grim. In his hands, he carried the shattered remains of their family Bible, the one his grandfather had carried west in a covered wagon, the one that contained the record of their marriage, their children's births, the careful genealogy of a family's life on the frontier. 43 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 43 years of building, and it's gone in 20 minutes. Pearl watched her husband sink onto a pile of lumber that had once been their porch railing, his shoulders sagging under the weight of devastation. At 64, Franklin Brewster had survived drought, economic panic, the death of 3 infant children, and the slow erosion of a man's strength by time and weather. But this complete erasure of everything they'd built together seemed to drain something essential from him. "Franklin," she started toward him, but he held up a hand. "Just give me a minute, Pearl. I need to think." But as she watched, his breathing became labored, shallow. His left hand clutched at his chest, and the color drained from his weathered face. The shattered Bible fell from his other hand as he doubled over, gasping. "Franklin!" Pearl rushed to his side as Josiah appeared, as if from nowhere, his mountain-trained reflexes bringing him to the crisis in an instant. "Help me get him flat," Josiah said, his voice calm but urgent. Together, they lowered Franklin to the ground, Josiah's experienced hands checking pulse and breathing with the efficiency of someone who dealt with medical emergencies far from any doctor. "Chest pains?" Josiah asked Franklin, who could only nod, his face gray with strain. Pearl knelt beside her husband, fear clawing at her chest. At their age, in the middle of nowhere, a heart episode could mean death. The nearest doctor was in Hutchinson, 20 miles away, over roads that were little more than wagon tracks. "What do we do?" she whispered. Josiah was already moving, pulling supplies from his pack with swift precision. "Keep him calm. Talk to him." He measured out what looked like willow bark powder into a tin cup, adding water from his canteen. "This will help with the pain. Had to use it on myself more than once up in the mountains." Franklin's breathing gradually steadied as the herbal mixture took effect, but the episode had shaken all 3 of them. Pearl held her husband's hand and felt how fragile his pulse seemed, how the strong grip that had wielded hammer and saw for 40 years now trembled slightly. "Can't afford to get sick," Franklin muttered, his voice still weak. "Too much to do." "The work isn't going anywhere," Josiah said quietly. "Rest now." But as the morning wore on, and Franklin remained pale and shaky, the reality of their situation became undeniable. They were 2 elderly people, alone on a devastated homestead, with winter approaching, and no shelter beyond what they could improvise from salvaged materials. Franklin's health scare had stripped away the last pretense that they could handle this crisis on their own. Pearl found herself really looking at the destruction for the first time, seeing it not through the haze of shock and denial, but with clear, practical eyes. The barn was completely gone, scattered across 3 counties, according to their neighbor Henderson, who'd ridden over that morning to check on them. The house was a total loss, except for the foundation and part of one wall that leaned at a dangerous angle. Their livestock had either been killed or scattered by the storm. The well was clogged with debris, and their winter supplies, carefully preserved food, stored grain, everything they'd need to survive the harsh Kansas winter, were buried somewhere in the wreckage or completely destroyed. At 67, she was too old to start over. They both were. The admission sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. "Mrs. Brewster." Josiah's voice interrupted her dark thoughts. He approached carefully, reading the despair in her posture. "Mind if I ask about your children? Are they in a position to help?" Pearl sighed, feeling the weight of complicated family relationships. "Robert's a lawyer in Chicago, good practice, but he's got 3 children and a wife who never much liked frontier life. Sarah married a doctor in Denver. They're comfortable, but they have their own responsibilities." "They know about the tornado?" Henderson was going to send a telegram from town. "But even if they come, what can they do? They can't stay indefinitely, and we can't abandon our land to go live with them." She looked around at the devastation. "This is our home, Mr. Cordell. Our life is here." Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving over the wreckage with the time, careful assessment she'd noticed the day before. "How much land do you have here?" "Quarter section, 160 acres. Franklin proved it up back in 79, right after we married." "Good water?" "The well's been reliable for 20 years. Sweet water never runs dry, even in drought years." "Timber rights to the creek bottom?" Pearl nodded, wondering where his questions were leading. "Franklin always said this was the best piece of land in 3 counties. That's why we stayed when others gave up and moved on." Josiah walked to the edge of what had been their yard, looking out over the grassland that stretched to the horizon. The tornado had left its mark here too, a clear path where the grass was flattened and debris was scattered, but the basic contours of the land remained unchanged. This was still good soil, still a place where crops would grow and cattle could graze. "Your husband's a skilled carpenter," he said finally, "and you know how to manage a household, how to make things work with what you've got." "What are you thinking?" Pearl asked, though part of her was afraid to hope. Josiah turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than careful distance in his expression. There was calculation there, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine concern. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that 3 people working together might accomplish what 2 people can't manage alone." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Pearl felt her heart start to beat faster, not with fear this time, but with the first faint stirring of possibility. "You're talking about staying longer than a few days," she said. "I'm talking about staying through the winter, helping you rebuild enough to be safe and comfortable. In the spring, when the weather breaks, we could see about putting up a proper house." Pearl stared at him. This stranger who'd ridden into their disaster like something out of a children's tale. "Why would you do that?" Josiah's hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket, where the damaged photograph rested against his heart. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she heard the emotion underneath. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. And because maybe it's time I stopped running from places where people need help." From where Franklin lay resting, his voice came weak but determined. "We can't pay you. Don't have the money for hired help." "Not looking for money," Josiah replied. "Looking for a place to spend the winter. A place where I can be useful instead of just surviving." Pearl felt tears prick her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself since the tornado hit. But they weren't tears of despair anymore. They were something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The decision made, Josiah moved with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to making shelter from nothing. By noon, he'd constructed a lean-to against the one remaining wall of the house, using salvaged lumber and a canvas tarp from his pack. It wasn't much, just enough space for 3 bedrolls and protection from wind and rain, but it represented something more significant than mere shelter. It was the first new thing built on the Brewster homestead since the tornado, a declaration that life would continue. Pearl watched him work, noting the careful way he tested each piece of salvaged wood before using it, how he chose the strongest joints and most stable supports. This was a man who'd learned to build things that would last, who understood that in harsh country, shoddy construction could mean the difference between life and death. "Hand me that cross brace," he said, and Pearl found herself following his instructions naturally, as if they'd worked together for years instead of days. There was something soothing about the rhythm of construction, about seeing order emerge from chaos, one board at a time. Franklin, still pale but insisting he felt stronger, sorted through the scattered tools. Many were damaged beyond repair, but his carpenter's eye identified those worth saving. The sight of his beloved handplane, cracked but still functional, brought the first smile Pearl had seen on his face since the storm. "My father gave me this plane," Franklin said, running his thumb along the familiar surface. "Made it himself from maple and steel. I taught my boy Robert to use it when he was 10 years old." "Good tools are like old friends," Josiah replied, examining the plane with the respect one craftsman showed another's work. "Worth fixing when they're broken." As afternoon settled into evening, Pearl found herself cooking over an open fire for the first time in 20 years. Her cast-iron stove was buried somewhere under the wreckage, but Josiah had fashioned a serviceable cooking arrangement from salvaged metal and stones. She discovered her tin recipe box, miraculously intact, wedged under what had been the pantry door. The box contained more than recipes. It held handwritten cards from her mother, notes from her children when they were small, careful calculations of measurements and costs that represented 40 years of feeding a family. As she opened it, the familiar scent of vanilla and cinnamon rose from the yellowed papers, and for a moment she was transported back to her mother's kitchen in Missouri, learning to make cornbread and apple pie. "Smells like home," Josiah said quietly, appearing beside the fire with an armload of firewood he'd gathered from the scattered remains of their fence posts. "My mother's cornbread recipe," Pearl replied, stirring the batter in a dented bowl. "I've made it 1,000 times, but tonight it feels like I'm learning all over again." They ate as the sun set, 3 people sharing a meal in the ruins of what had once been a comfortable home. The conversation came easier now, the initial awkwardness of strangers giving way to something that felt almost like companionship. "How long you been traveling, Mr. Cordell?" Franklin asked, his appetite returning along with his color. "Better part of 3 years," Josiah replied. "Left the mountains after I decided there wasn't anything left there for me." Pearl caught the hesitation, the careful editing of whatever truth lay behind his wandering. She'd seen enough loss in her life to recognize someone carrying a burden of grief, but she also knew better than to push. In her experience, people revealed their sorrows when they were ready, and not a moment before. "Must have seen a lot of country," she said instead. "More than I wanted to, less than I needed to." Josiah poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "Funny thing about traveling, you think you're running towards something, but mostly you're just running." Franklin leaned back against his bedroll, studying their unexpected guest in the firelight. "What made you stop running here?" The question hung in the air while Josiah considered his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of honesty that surprised them all. "Saw you two standing in all this wreckage, and I remembered what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. Remembered how it felt when nobody came to help." He paused, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Figured maybe I could be the help I wished I'd had." Pearl felt her heart constrict at the pain in his voice. Whatever losses had driven this man to 3 years of solitary wandering, they'd cut deep enough to make him empathize with strangers. She found herself wondering about the woman and child in the photograph, about what catastrophe had torn his family apart. Well, Franklin said gruffly, we're grateful for the help and the company. As the fire burned lower, they began to establish the small routines that would govern their temporary life. Together, Pearl would handle the cooking and what household management was possible. Franklin would lead the salvage operations, deciding what was worth saving and what should be burned or buried. Josiah would provide the muscle and expertise for the heavier work, the building and clearing that required strength and skill. It was a practical arrangement, born of necessity rather than affection. But as Pearl lay in her bedroll that night, listening to Franklin's steady breathing and the occasional crackle of the dying fire, she found herself thinking about the careful way Josiah had tested each board before using it, the gentle way he'd examined Franklin's damaged tools, the pain she'd glimpsed behind his controlled exterior. 3 damaged people, she thought. 3 people who'd learned that life could change in 20 minutes of wind, who understood loss in ways that couldn't be explained to those who'd never faced it. Maybe that shared understanding could be the foundation for something stronger than mere survival. The next morning brought their first real test of cooperation. The debris needed to be sorted systematically, lumber that could be reused in one pile, metal that could be salvaged in another, everything else cleared away to make room for rebuilding. It was overwhelming work, made worse by the emotional weight of handling the broken pieces of a lifetime. Pearl found herself holding fragments of her grandmother's china, carefully collected pieces of plates and teacups that had survived the journey west, only to be destroyed by Kansas wind. Each shard told a story, the cup she'd drunk from every morning for 20 years, the serving platter that had held Christmas dinners and birthday cakes. Save what you can, Josiah said gently, seeing her struggle. Even broken things sometimes have value. He showed her how to wrap the larger pieces in cloth, how to sort them by pattern and color. My wife used to say that broken china could be mended with gold, made more beautiful than it was before. Japanese do it, apparently. Call it something that means golden repair. Pearl looked up at him, surprised by this glimpse into his lost life. Your Catherine sounds like a wise woman. She was that, Josiah agreed quietly. Taught me more than I deserved to learn. By midday, they'd established a rhythm that made the overwhelming task feel manageable. Franklin directed operations from a chair Josiah had fashioned from salvaged lumber, his eye for useful materials making the sorting more efficient. Pearl documented what they found, keeping careful lists that would help them plan whatever rebuilding was possible. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they began to function as a unit, rather than 3 separate people sharing space. When Pearl needed something heavy moved, she asked Josiah. When Franklin couldn't remember where they'd stored something, Pearl knew. When Josiah was unsure about the value of a damaged piece of equipment, Franklin provided the expertise. Small kindnesses emerged naturally. Josiah made sure Franklin had the most comfortable seat and the best position for directing the work. Pearl saved the choicest pieces of their meager meals for her companions. Franklin shared stories about the history of each salvaged item, giving their work context and meaning. As the sun set on their second full day together, Pearl realized that something had shifted. The careful distance of strangers was giving way to the easier familiarity of people who were learning to depend on each other. It wasn't family, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become family, given time and care and the willingness to trust. The land deed emerged from the wreckage on the 4th day, water-stained but intact, wrapped in the oiled leather pouch where Franklin had kept his important papers. Pearl watched her husband smooth out the document with trembling hands, his finger tracing the official seal that proclaimed their ownership of this quarter section of Kansas prairie, filed September 15th, 1879. Franklin read aloud. 160 acres, more or less, granted to Franklin James Brewster and his heirs and assigns forever. He looked up at Pearl, with something approaching his old pride. This is still ours, Pearl. Whatever else we've lost, this land is still ours. Josiah, who'd been clearing debris from what had been their front yard, paused to examine the deed with interest. "Good farmland," he observed. "I can see why you chose to stay when others moved on." "Wasn't always easy," Franklin admitted, settling back into his salvage chair. "First few years nearly broke us. Drought in 80, grasshoppers in 82, and the winter of 83 was so harsh we burned furniture just to keep warm. But we held on." "Why?" Josiah asked. "What kept you here when you could have gone somewhere easier?" Pearl and Franklin exchanged a look that carried 43 years of shared history. "Tell him about the first harvest," Pearl said softly. Franklin's weathered face softened with memory. 1880, our second year. We'd planted wheat on 40 acres, gambling everything we had on that crop. All summer we watched it grow, praying for rain but not too much, watching for signs of disease or pests. Come harvest time, we had the finest stand of wheat anyone had seen in 3 counties. Grain elevator man from Hutchinson came out personal to look at it, Pearl added. Said it was premium grade, worth top dollar. That night, after we sold the crop, Pearl and I walked out to the middle of our field and just stood there. Franklin continued. The sunset was painting everything gold, and the wind was moving through the stubble, and I said to her, "Pearl, this is it. This is home. This is the place we'll build our life." Josiah listened with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of such moments. "And you never regretted it?" "Oh, we had our doubts," Pearl said honestly, "when the babies came too early and didn't make it through their first winters. When Franklin broke his leg that time and couldn't work for 3 months. When Robert left for college and Sarah married her doctor, and we knew they'd never come back to farm life. But we always came back to that feeling," Franklin said. "That sense of belonging somewhere, of having a place that was truly ours. This land chose us as much as we chose it." As the days passed, that sense of belonging began to extend beyond just Franklin and Pearl. Josiah threw himself into the work with an intensity that spoke of more than mere helpfulness. He approached each task with the thoroughness of someone who intended to stay, who was invested in the outcome rather than just passing through. When they cleared the foundation, he didn't just remove debris, he examined every stone, noting weak points that might need reinforcement when they rebuilt. When they sorted lumber, he didn't just separate good wood from bad. He categorized it by size and quality, planning future projects in his mind. "You're thinking like this is your place too," Pearl observed one afternoon as she watched him carefully stack salvaged boards according to some system only he understood. Josiah paused, a 2x4 balanced in his hands. "Sorry, didn't mean to presume." "I'm not complaining," Pearl interrupted gently. "I'm grateful. It's just that you're working like a man with a stake in the outcome." For a moment, Josiah's carefully maintained emotional distance wavered. "Been a long time since I had reason to build instead of just survive," he said quietly. "Feels good to work toward something instead of just away from it." The physical labor was healing in ways that surprised them all. Franklin, despite his age and recent health scare, seemed to gain strength from having meaningful work to do. His color improved, and his appetite returned as he rediscovered purpose in directing their salvage operations. Pearl found that the repetitive tasks, sorting, cleaning, organizing, gave her mind space to process their losses, while her hands stayed busy with useful work. There was satisfaction in imposing order on chaos, in making decisions about what could be saved and what must be discarded. For Josiah, the work seemed to provide something he'd been missing during his years of wandering. Each completed task, each problem solved, each small improvement to their situation appeared to anchor him more firmly to this place and these people. By the end of the first week, they'd cleared enough space to begin planning their winter shelter. The lean-to was adequate for the warm fall weather, but Kansas winters were brutal, and they'd need something more substantial to survive until spring rebuilding could begin. "Root cellars still sound," Franklin noted, examining the underground space where they'd sheltered during the tornado. "We could expand it, add a proper entrance and some ventilation. Build a cabin on top using the salvaged lumber. How much lumber do we have that's usable? Josiah asked, consulting the inventory lists Pearl had been keeping. Enough for framing a small structure, she replied. Maybe 12 by 16 feet, if we're careful with our cuts and joints. That'll be tight quarters for 3 people through a Kansas winter, Franklin observed. But doable, Josiah said firmly. I've wintered in smaller spaces up in the mountains. The key is good insulation and efficient heating. As they planned, Pearl found herself watching the easy way Franklin and Josiah worked together. Despite the difference in their backgrounds, one a lifetime farmer and carpenter, the other a mountain man and wanderer, they shared a common language of practical problem-solving. They understood materials and weather, stress and structural integrity. They thought in terms of function over form, durability over appearance. You learned carpentry somewhere, Franklin said to Josiah as they sketched rough plans in the dirt. This isn't mountain improvisation. This is real building knowledge. Josiah's hands stilled on the stick he'd been using to draw. My father was a builder back in Pennsylvania. Taught me the trade before I went west. He paused, seeming to debate how much to reveal. Built houses in Denver for a few years, before I took to the mountains. What changed? Pearl asked gently. Life changed, Josiah replied, his voice carefully neutral. Priorities changed. Found out that building houses for other people wasn't the same as building a home for your own family. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Pearl heard it anyway. She was beginning to understand that this man's losses ran deeper than simple bereavement. There were layers of regret and guilt wrapped up in his solitary wandering, self-imposed exile that had more to do with what he believed he deserved than what circumstances had forced upon him. That evening, as they shared their simple meal around the fire, Pearl made a decision that would change the tone of their growing relationship. Josiah, she said quietly, would you tell us about your family, about Catherine and Anna? The silence that followed was so complete that the crackle of burning wood seemed loud as gunshots. Josiah's face went very still, and for a moment Pearl thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat back behind the walls of privacy he'd maintained since his arrival. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. They died in the fire. House I built for them burned down while I was away on a job. Catherine and Anna, they never had a chance to get out. The words fell into the quiet evening like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding and sympathy that would change everything between them. The handmade axe caught the morning light like a promise kept. Josiah had forged it, himself in the mountains, balancing the weight and honing the edge until it felt like an extension of his own arm. Now, as he began the careful work of preparing timber for their winter cabin, each swing carried the precision of years spent working alone, where a poorly placed cut could mean the difference between shelter and exposure. Franklin watched from his chair, noting how Josiah tested each piece of salvaged lumber before committing to any cuts. That's fine work, he said, gesturing to the axe. Not many men know how to balance a tool like that anymore. Learned from necessity, Josiah replied, pausing to examine a beam that had once supported the Brewsters' front porch. When you're 50 miles from the nearest blacksmith, you either learn to make your own tools or you do without. The revelation about his family's death had changed something fundamental between them. The careful distance Josiah had maintained was cracking, allowing glimpses of the man he'd been before. Grief drove him to the mountains. Pearl could see it in the way he worked, not just efficiently, but with a craftsman's care for detail that spoke of building things meant to last. The fire, Franklin said carefully, testing the waters of this new openness. Was it the house that drove you away from building? Josiah's hands stilled on the axe handle. For a moment, Pearl thought he might retreat back into silence. Instead, he set down the tool and looked directly at Franklin. I built that house with my own hands, he said quietly. Every board, every nail, every joint. Thought I was building something safe, something permanent. When I came back from the job and saw the ashes, he stopped, swallowing hard. I kept thinking about all the things I could have done differently. The chimney design, the placement of the stairs, the materials I chose. If I'd been a better builder, maybe they'd have had time to escape. Pearl felt her heart break a little for this man who'd been carrying such an impossible burden. Josiah, you can't know that. Fires happen, even the best-built houses. Maybe, he interrupted, but his tone suggested he'd never truly accepted that possibility. Took to the mountains because I couldn't stand the sight of other people's houses. Couldn't trust myself to build anything that might shelter a family. Franklin leaned forward in his chair, his carpenter's understanding bridging the gap between them. But you're building for us now? Different, Josiah said, picking up the axe again. You two have already survived the worst thing that could happen to a home. Lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place. As the days passed, their winter shelter began to take shape. Josiah's mountain building techniques proved invaluable. He knew how to construct walls that would hold against harsh winds, how to design a roof that would shed snow rather than collapse under its weight, how to create ventilation that would prevent the dangerous buildup of cooking smoke and moisture. But more than his technical skills, his attention to Pearl and Franklin's specific needs showed a thoughtfulness that spoke of genuine caring. He placed the single window where Pearl would get the best morning light for her sewing. He built Franklin's sleeping area with extra support for his aging joints. He designed the storage spaces to accommodate Pearl's careful organization of their limited supplies. "You're thinking like family," Pearl observed one afternoon as she watched him carefully measure twice before making a cut. "Building for people, you know, not just anyone." Josiah paused in his work, considering her words. "Maybe," he said finally. "Been so long since I built for people I cared about, I'd forgotten what it felt like." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Caring meant investment, meant the possibility of loss, meant opening himself to the kind of pain he'd been running from for 3 years. As the cabin's frame took shape, so did the deeper bonds between its builders. Franklin began sharing his woodworking techniques, showing Josiah joinery methods that had been passed down through generations of German craftsmen. Josiah reciprocated by teaching Franklin how to work with green timber, how to compensate for wood that would continue to dry and shrink after installation. Pearl found herself included in their technical discussions, her practical knowledge of household needs informing every design decision. Where should the cooking area be placed for maximum efficiency and safety? How much storage would they need for winter supplies? What was the best way to arrange sleeping areas for privacy and warmth? Never built with a woman's input before, Josiah admitted one evening as they reviewed the day's progress. Makes a difference having someone who knows how a space will actually be lived in. "Catherine never had opinions about your building?" Pearl asked gently. A smile ghosted across Josiah's weathered features, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Oh, she had opinions, strong ones, but I was too proud to listen much in those days. Thought I knew better because I had the training and the tools. And now? Now I know that the person who has to live in a space knows things the builder never learned in any apprenticeship." As October deepened into November, their work took on an urgency driven by the changing weather. The first frost came early, painting the grass silver and reminding them all that winter would wait for no one. But the urgency brought with it a kind of intimacy, born of shared purpose and mutual dependence. They worked longer days, starting before dawn and continuing past sunset by the light of lanterns Josiah had salvaged from the wreckage. Pearl kept hot coffee and food ready, maintaining their strength for the demanding physical labor. Franklin pushed himself beyond what his age should have allowed, driven by pride and the need to contribute meaningfully to their survival. And through it all, Josiah worked with a steady determination that spoke of more than mere obligation. This wasn't just a winter shelter he was building. It was a home for people who'd become important to him, a structure that needed to protect not just bodies, but the fragile bonds they'd formed. "Why didn't you ever remarry?" Pearl asked one evening as they sat around their fire, too tired for more work but not yet ready for sleep. The question surprised Josiah into honesty. "Never found anyone who could make me forget Catherine, and it seemed wrong to marry someone just to avoid being alone." "Loneliness is a hard burden to carry," Franklin said quietly. "So is guilt," Josiah replied. "Seemed like maybe I deserved the loneliness. Payment for failing the people who trusted me to keep them safe." Pearl studied his face in the firelight, seeing the deep grooves that pain had carved there. "And now, do you still believe you deserve to be alone?" Josiah was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder, as if he was discovering something new about himself. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But for the first time in 3 years, I'm not sure I want to be." Pearl's quilting needles had survived the tornado through sheer chance, tucked away in their small wooden case and buried under debris that had protected rather than destroyed them. As November's chill settled over the plains, she found herself reaching for them in the evenings, piecing together scraps of fabric salvaged from their ruined clothing and household linens. "What are you making?" Josiah asked, settling beside the fire after a long day of chinking the cabin walls with mud and prairie grass. "A quilt for our new home," Pearl replied, holding up a square of blue gingham that had once been her best Sunday dress. "Crazy quilt pattern when you don't have matching pieces. You make the differences part of the design." Franklin watched his wife's careful stitching with the appreciation of someone who understood precision work. "Pearl's always been able to take broken pieces and make something beautiful from them. Made our whole house that way, one careful choice at a time." The words carried deeper meaning than furniture arrangement, and Josiah heard it. He'd been watching Pearl work her quiet magic on their temporary household for weeks now, turning their crude shelter into something that felt like home through small touches of comfort and care. A salvaged tablecloth spread over their makeshift table. Wildflowers gathered in a dented tin can. Meals that somehow tasted better despite being cooked over an open fire. "My Catherine used to say the same thing about quilting," Josiah said quietly. "Surprising them both. Said it was like life. You took whatever pieces came your way and tried to make them into something useful and warm." It was the first time he'd spoken of his wife with anything approaching peace rather than pain. Pearl looked up from her stitching, recognizing the shift in his tone. "Tell us about her," she said gently. "What was she like?" Josiah stared into the fire for a long moment, and Pearl thought he might retreat back into silence. Instead, he began to speak, slowly at first, then with growing ease. "She was small, barely came up to my shoulder, but she had the strongest will of anyone I ever met. Came west with her father when she was 16, after her mother died. Married me when she was 19, and I thought I was the luckiest man in Colorado Territory." "How did you meet?" Franklin asked. A ghost of a smile crossed Josiah's features. "I was building a church in Denver, and she came by every day to check on the progress. Finally told me I was doing the window frames all wrong, that they'd never keep out the winter wind with those gaps." "Was she right?" Pearl asked, already knowing the answer. From Josiah's expression. "Course she was right. Had to tear out 3 days' work and start over. But she brought me coffee every morning after that, and by the time the church was finished, I'd worked up the courage to ask her father for permission to court her." The fire crackled in the comfortable silence that followed. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with the sound of approaching winter, but inside their small circle of light, there was warmth and the gentle pleasure of shared stories. "Anna looked just like her mother," Josiah continued, his voice growing softer. "Same dark hair, same stubborn chin, only 3 years old when," he stopped, swallowing hard. "She used to follow me around when I was working, carrying a little wooden hammer Catherine made for her. Said she was going to be a builder like Papa. Pearl felt tears prick her eyes at the image of a small girl with her toy hammer trying to help her father build their world. The loss of such innocent trust, such uncomplicated love, explained so much about the careful distance Josiah maintained from anything that might require his protection. "They'd have been proud of what you're building here," Franklin said quietly. "This cabin, it's good work, Josiah. Honest work that'll keep people safe." "Maybe," Josiah replied, but for the first time, Pearl heard the possibility that he might actually believe it. As the walls of their winter home grew higher, so did the emotional walls between them grow lower. The physical work had created a rhythm of cooperation that extended beyond mere survival. They anticipated each other's needs, shared tools and tasks without being asked, settled into routines that felt natural rather than forced. Franklin's strength had returned gradually, his heart stabilized by regular meals, purposeful work, and the comfort of knowing he wasn't facing the crisis alone. He'd begun teaching Josiah the finer points of Finnish carpentry, how to cut joints that would stay tight through years of seasonal expansion and contraction, how to select wood grain for maximum strength and beauty. "You've got good hands for this work," Franklin told him one afternoon as they fitted the cabin's door frame. "Patient hands. Most young men want to rush, but you understand that good building takes time." "Had a good teacher once," Josiah replied, thinking of his father's patient instruction back in Pennsylvania. "And I learned the hard way that corners cut in building come back to haunt you." Pearl divided her time between traditional women's work, cooking, mending, organizing their limited possessions, and participating in the construction planning. Her practical knowledge proved invaluable in countless small ways. She knew how to arrange workspace for maximum efficiency, how to preserve food through the winter months, how to create comfort from the simplest materials. But more than her domestic skills, her emotional intelligence guided the delicate process of three strangers becoming a family. She mediated the small tensions that arose when Franklin's pride clashed with Josiah's experience, or when Josiah's perfectionism slowed progress that Franklin wanted to see completed quickly. "You're the heart of this operation," Franklin told her one evening as they sat around their fire. "The day's work done and their cabin nearly complete. Josiah and we know how to build with wood and stone, but you know how to build with people." Pearl felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment. At 67, she'd sometimes wondered if her contributions mattered as much as they once had, if age had diminished her value to the world. But here, in the ruins of their old life, she'd discovered new purpose in helping heal a broken man and strengthen the bonds that would see them all through the coming winter. "We all bring what we have," she said simply, "and what we have together is more than any of us could manage alone." As October melted into November, and the first snows began to dust the prairie, their cabin stood ready to shelter them through the harsh months ahead. But more important than the physical structure was the emotional architecture they'd built together, a foundation of trust and affection that transformed necessity into choice, survival into hope. On the evening they moved into their completed winter home, Pearl lit a candle from her salvaged belongings and set it in the single window Josiah had placed to catch the morning light. "For new beginnings," she said simply. Franklin raised his cup of coffee in a toast. "To new beginnings." Josiah hesitated for only a moment before raising his own cup. "To family," he said quietly, "however it comes to you and wherever you find it." Outside, the wind sang its endless prairie song, but inside their carefully built walls, three souls who'd learned to trust again settled into the warmth they'd created together. The bank foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, carried by a young clerk from Hutchinson who looked embarrassed to be the bearer of such news. Pearl took the official document with hands that trembled only slightly, though her heart was racing as she read the formal language that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. She read aloud to Franklin and Josiah, who'd gathered around their small kitchen table. whereas the mortgagor Franklin James Brewster has failed to make payments due on the mortgage dated March 15th, 1,923 in the amount of $800. Franklin's face went ashen as the full implications hit him. $800, he whispered. Might as well be 8,000 for all the chance we have of raising it. Josiah looked between them, confusion and growing concern evident on his weathered features. Mortgage? I thought you owned this land free and clear. The silence that followed was heavy with shame and regret. Finally, Franklin forced himself to meet Josiah's eyes. We did own it free and clear. For 40 years this land was ours without debt or obligation. His voice cracked with the weight of confession. Then Robert, our son, his law practice in Chicago, ran into trouble. Bad investments, a partner who embezzled funds. He was going to lose everything, maybe face criminal charges. Pearl reached across the table to take her husband's hand, sharing the burden of their decision. He asked us for help, begged us, really. Said if we could mortgage the homestead for a loan, he could save his practice and his reputation. How much? Josiah asked quietly. $1,500, Franklin replied. Seemed like a fortune, but the bank appraiser said the land was worth twice that. The payments were $50 every 6 months, manageable from our crop income and the money Robert promised to send. But Robert never sent the money, Pearl continued, her voice heavy with disappointment. His practice recovered, but he said he needed to rebuild his reserves before he could start repaying us. Then came the tornado, and we missed the October payment. Josiah studied the foreclosure notice with the careful attention of someone who understood legal documents. When's the sale date? December 20th, Pearl read from the bottom of the page. Sheriff's auction on the courthouse steps in Hutchinson. Property to be sold to the highest bidder for cash. 3 weeks, Franklin said, slumping in his chair, as if the fight had gone out of him completely. 3 weeks to come up with $800 plus penalties and fees, or lose everything we've worked for our entire lives. The cruel irony wasn't lost on any of them. They'd survived the tornado, rebuilt their shelter, formed bonds stronger than many families bound by blood, only to face eviction from the very land that had brought them together. What about your son? Josiah asked. Can he help now? Pearl's laugh was bitter. I sent him a telegram yesterday through Henderson. Robert wired back that his finances are still precarious and he can't spare the funds. Suggested we might be happier living closer to family anyway. Closer to family, Franklin repeated, his voice thick with hurt and anger. After we mortgaged our home to save his reputation, he thinks we should be grateful for the chance to become his dependents. Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving from the foreclosure notice to the faces of the two people who'd become more important to him than anyone had been since he'd lost Catherine and Anna. Pearl could see him processing the information, calculating possibilities, weighing options with the methodical thoroughness that characterized everything he did. How much would it take to stop the foreclosure? He asked finally. Franklin consulted the notice again. $800 for the missed payments, plus interest and fees. The clerk said probably close to $900 total. $900, Josiah repeated softly, and something in his tone made Pearl look at him more carefully. There was decision in his posture, a settling of shoulders that suggested he'd made up his mind about something significant. Josiah, she said carefully, what are you thinking? Instead of answering directly, he stood and walked to his bedroll, retrieving something from his pack that he'd kept carefully hidden since his arrival. When he returned to the table, he carried a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal against metal. 3 years in the mountains, he said quietly, setting the pouch on the table between them. 3 years of living on almost nothing, working claims that other men had abandoned, finding gold in places where most folks wouldn't think to look. Franklin stared at the pouch as if it might contain snakes. Josiah, we can't. Let me finish, Josiah interrupted gently. He opened the pouch and poured its contents onto the table. Gold coins caught the lamplight, more money than Pearl had seen in one place in her entire life. $1,200 in gold eagles, Josiah said matter-of-factly, enough to pay off the mortgage and have some left over for spring planting. The silence that followed was deafening. Pearl felt tears spring to her eyes, not of relief, but of overwhelming emotion at the magnitude of what Josiah was offering. Franklin's face cycled through disbelief, gratitude, and stubborn pride. "We can't take your money," Franklin said finally. "That's your life savings, your security." "What good is security if you have no one to share it with?" Josiah replied. "I've been carrying this gold for 3 years, and it never made me anything but lonely. Money's only valuable if it can buy you something you actually want." "And what do you want?" Pearl asked softly. Josiah looked around their small cabin, at the careful craftsmanship that had gone into every joint and beam, at the touches of home Pearl had added with salvaged fabric and carefully tended plants, at Franklin's tools arranged with the pride of a master craftsman. "I want to stay," he said simply. "I want this to be my home too, permanently. I want to help you rebuild in the spring, see this place become everything it was before the tornado, and more. I want to belong somewhere again." Franklin's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to shed. "Josiah, you don't understand what you're offering. This isn't a loan we could pay back. Our farming income won't support repaying that kind of money." "I'm not asking for repayment," Josiah said firmly. "I'm asking for partnership. I'm asking to be part of this family, to invest in this land the same way you have. To have a place where my work matters, where the people matter." Pearl felt her heart breaking and healing at the same time. She understood what this offer meant to Josiah. It wasn't charity or even kindness. It was a desperate bid for belonging, a man's willingness to trade everything he owned for the chance to have a family again. "The legal complications," Franklin began. "We'll figure out the legal complications," Pearl interrupted, her voice firm with decision. "We'll draw up papers that protect everyone's interests. But Josiah's right. This land needs all of us to make it work. And we need him just as much as he needs us." She reached across the table and covered Josiah's weathered hands with her own. "If you're sure about this, if you truly want to stay and be part of what we're building here, then yes. Yes, we accept your offer." Franklin looked from his wife to Josiah, seeing the hope and determination in both their faces. Finally, his carpenter's pragmatism won out over his pride. "Partners," he said, extending his hand to Josiah. "Equal partners in whatever comes next." As they shook hands across the table, covered with gold coins and legal documents, Pearl realized that the tornado had taken their house, but given them something far more valuable. It had brought them Josiah, and through crisis and cooperation, they'd built something stronger than walls and roof beams. They'd built a family worth saving. The leather pouch that held Josiah's gold had traveled thousands of miles through mountain passes and prairie towns, a tangible reminder of 3 years spent in self-imposed exile. Now, as Pearl carefully counted the coins by lamplight, each piece represented more than monetary value. It was a measure of trust, sacrifice, and the transformation of a lonely man into someone willing to risk everything for the chance to belong. $1,240, she announced, setting the last gold eagle on the neat stack. "More than enough for the mortgage and legal fees." Franklin sat across from her. The foreclosure notice spread flat on the table between them, like a declaration of war. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he traced the official seal, the weight of their situation pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. 43 years we've owned this land," he said quietly. 43 years of payments to no one, of knowing every acre belonged to us and our children after us. And I threw it all away for a son who couldn't be bothered to help when we needed it most. Josiah, who'd been standing by the window, watching the first snowfall of winter dust the prairie, turned back to face them. "You threw it away for family," he corrected gently, "for love and loyalty and the hope that blood meant something. There's no shame in that, Franklin, isn't there?" Franklin's voice carried the bitter edge of a man questioning everything he'd believed about duty and sacrifice. I mortgaged my wife's security for a boy who won't even send a telegram of sympathy after we've lost our home to a tornado. Pearl reached across the table to cover her husband's hand with her own. At 67, she'd learned that regret was a luxury they couldn't afford, that survival required looking forward rather than backward. What's done is done, she said firmly. The question now is what we do next. Josiah's offering us a way to save our home and our future. The only question is whether our pride is more important than our survival. The three of them had spent the previous evening discussing the practical details of Josiah's proposal, how to structure the legal arrangement that would protect everyone's interests, whether to add Josiah's name to the deed or create some other form of partnership agreement, how to handle the social complications of an unconventional family arrangement in a community that valued traditional structures. People will talk, Franklin had warned. Three unmarried adults living together, sharing property and resources. Folks won't know what to make of it. Let them talk, Pearl had replied with characteristic practicality. We know who we are and what we mean to each other. That's all that matters. But now, with the gold counted and the decision made, the reality of what they were attempting began to settle over them like the snow outside their window. They were about to walk into the Hutchinson Bank and challenge a foreclosure with an unmarried stranger's savings, then ask the community to accept their unconventional arrangement as legitimate. I've been thinking about the legal papers, Josiah said, settling into his chair at the table. If we're going to do this, we should do it right. Full partnership agreement, with all three names on the deed. Franklin's eyebrows rose. That's a big step, Josiah. Once your name's on that deed, you're tied to this place as much as we are. That's the idea, Josiah replied simply. I'm tired of being a visitor in my own life. Tired of being able to walk away from everything I care about. Pearl studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the determination that had replaced the careful distance he'd maintained when he first arrived. This wasn't just about money or legal arrangements, it was about a man choosing to plant roots again after years of drifting. What happens if it doesn't work out? She asked gently. What if living together permanently isn't as easy as surviving a crisis together? Josiah was quiet for a moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. Then we'll figure out how to make it work, he said finally. Or we'll figure out how to separate our interests without destroying what we've built. But I don't think that's going to happen, Pearl. I think we've found something here that's worth whatever complications it brings. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distances seem both infinite and intimately close. As they prepared for the journey to Hutchinson, each of them carried the weight of what the day would bring: salvation or disappointment, depending on how the bank officials received their unconventional solution. Pearl packed the gold coins back into Josiah's leather pouch, handling each piece with the respect due to something that could change their lives forever. Franklin gathered the foreclosure papers and the original deed, documents that represented both their crisis and their hope. Josiah harnessed his horse to a wagon he'd built from salvaged materials, preparing for the 20-mile journey to town. Whatever happens today, Pearl said as they loaded supplies for the trip, I want you both to know that these months since the tornado have been some of the best of my life. Not because of what we lost, but because of what we found together. Franklin nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Never thought I'd say this, but that storm might have been the best thing that ever happened to us. Brought us Josiah, brought us back to what really matters. As they drove across the snow-dusted prairie, the conversation turned to practical matters and future plans. If they could save the homestead, spring would bring the challenge of rebuilding not just a house, but a proper farm operation that could support 3 people. They talked about crop rotations and livestock, about the new barn they'd need to build, and the improvements they could make to their water system. But underneath the practical planning, ran a current of deeper emotion, the knowledge that they were fighting not just for land or financial security, but for the right to continue being a family. The foreclosure threatened more than their home. It threatened to scatter them back to their separate loneliness. "I keep thinking about what we'll tell people," Franklin said as the outskirts of Hutchinson came into view. "How do we explain what this arrangement means to us?" "We tell them the truth," Josiah replied. "That family isn't always about blood or marriage vows. Sometimes it's about people who choose to take care of each other, to build something together that none of them could manage alone." The bank building loomed ahead of them, its imposing brick facade suggesting permanence and authority. Pearl felt her stomach tighten with nervous anticipation as they tied up their horse and gathered their papers. So much depended on the next few hours, not just their financial future, but their right to continue the life they'd built together. "Ready?" Josiah asked, the leather pouch heavy in his coat pocket. Pearl took a deep breath, drawing strength from the presence of these two men who'd become so important to her. "Ready." As they climbed the steps to the bank entrance, she caught sight of their reflection in the polished windows, three weathered figures who'd survived tornado and heartbreak, and the slow work of learning to trust again. Whatever the day brought, they'd face it together. The heavy doors swung open, and they stepped into the marble-floored lobby where their future would be decided. Behind them, the winter wind swept across the prairie they'd learned to call home, carrying the scent of snow and possibility. Inside Josiah's coat, the gold coins clinked softly with each step, not just payment for a debt, but an investment in the radical idea that family could be chosen rather than inherited, built rather than born into. At the teller window, a young clerk looked up expectantly. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Franklin cleared his throat and stepped forward, the foreclosure notice in his hand and 43 years of pride in his voice. "We're here about the Brewster mortgage. We'd like to discuss settling the account in full." The moment of truth had arrived. Whatever came next would determine whether their unconventional family would survive or scatter like tumbleweeds in the endless Kansas wind. The key to their completed house hung heavy in Franklin's weathered palm as they stood before Mr. Harrison, the bank president whose stern expression suggested he'd foreclosed on more dreams than he cared to remember. The simple iron key represented everything they'd built together, not just walls and roof beams, but trust and belonging, and the radical notion that family could be chosen rather than inherited. $923, Harrison said, consulting the ledger spread before him on his polished mahogany desk. "That's the total amount required to bring the Brewster mortgage current and prevent foreclosure." Josiah reached into his coat and withdrew the leather pouch, its weight familiar after 3 years of carrying it through mountain camps and prairie towns. As he poured the gold eagles onto Harrison's desk, the coins caught the winter light, streaming through the bank's tall windows, each piece representing weeks of solitary labor in played-out claims that other men had abandoned. $1,240 in gold coin, Josiah said quietly, more than sufficient to settle the debt. Harrison's eyebrows rose as he examined the coins with practiced efficiency. Gold was still king in farming country, more trusted than paper currency or bank drafts. The weight and purity were immediately apparent to his experienced eye. "These funds, they belong to you, Mr. Cordell?" "They do," Josiah confirmed. "Earned through legitimate mining operations in Colorado territory. I can provide documentation if required." "And you're paying this debt. Why, exactly?" Harrison's tone suggested suspicion of any arrangement that didn't follow conventional patterns. "The mortgage is in Franklin Brewster's name. You have no legal obligation to this property." This was the moment Pearl had been dreading, the confrontation with a world that demanded explanations for relationships that couldn't be reduced to simple legal categories. She watched Franklin's jaw tighten with the same pride that had made accepting help so difficult, saw Josiah's careful stillness that meant he was preparing to defend something precious. "Because they're family," Josiah said simply, Not by blood or marriage, but by choice. We've built a life together on that land, and I'm investing in our shared future." Harrison's expression remained skeptical. "Family by choice, I see." He made a note in his ledger. "And what assurances does the bank have that this arrangement is stable, that Mr. Cordell won't decide next month that he wants his gold back and the property sold?" Franklin leaned forward, his carpenter's hands flat on the desk surface. "We'd like to modify the deed, Mr. Harrison, add Josiah's name as equal partner in the property. Make this arrangement legal and binding." "Equal partners," Harrison repeated, his tone suggesting this was precisely the complication he'd expected. 3 unmarried adults sharing property ownership. The legal implications alone are manageable, Josiah interrupted quietly. "We've discussed this thoroughly. Full partnership agreement with survivor benefits, shared responsibilities for taxes and improvements, equal rights to the property, regardless of what happens to any individual partner." Pearl watched Harrison's face as he processed this unconventional arrangement. She could see him calculating the social implications, the potential gossip, the challenge to traditional family structures that his conservative community might find difficult to accept. "Mr. Cordell," Harrison said finally, "forgive my directness, but what prevents you from simply claiming ownership of this property once your money has paid the mortgage? What protects the Brewsters' interests in this arrangement?" It was a fair question, and Pearl felt a moment of appreciation for Harrison's thoroughness, even as she worried about his ultimate decision. But Josiah's answer came without hesitation. "Honor protects their interests, Mr. Harrison. My word, given freely and without coercion. But if you need legal protections, we can structure the deed transfer to require unanimous consent for any major decisions about the property." Harrison studied. The 3 of them, with the careful attention of a man whose business required reading character as much as financial statements. Pearl felt the weight of his assessment, knowing that their entire future hung on his willingness to approve this unconventional arrangement. "The mortgage will be satisfied in full," Harrison said finally, "but the deed modification will require additional paperwork, recording fees, and time for our legal counsel to review the partnership agreement." "How much time?" Franklin asked, his voice tight with anxiety. 2 weeks minimum, possibly longer if there are complications with the language or recording requirements. Pearl felt her heart sink. 2 weeks was cutting dangerously close to the December 20th foreclosure date. If anything went wrong, if there were delays or legal challenges, they could still lose everything despite Josiah's sacrifice. "What happens to the foreclosure proceedings during this review period?" she asked. "They're suspended, pending resolution of the payment and deed modification," Harrison replied. "But if the partnership agreement can't be finalized by December 20th, the original foreclosure will proceed regardless of the payment." The room fell silent, except for the tick of Harrison's desk clock and the distant sound of street traffic outside. Pearl could feel the tension radiating from both men, Franklin's fear of losing their home despite Josiah's generosity, and Josiah's worry that legal complications might invalidate his gesture of faith. "We'll make it work," Pearl said firmly, her voice cutting through their shared anxiety. "Whatever paperwork is required, whatever documentation you need, we'll provide it. This family has survived a tornado and 43 years of prairie life. We can handle 2 weeks of legal proceedings." Harrison's stern expression softened slightly at her determination. "Very well, Mrs. Brewster. Let's begin the paperwork." As he reached for the necessary forms, the simple iron key seemed to grow warmer in Franklin's palm, not just a symbol of shelter, but a promise that their chosen family would have a legal foundation as strong as the emotional bonds they'd built together. The new family photograph felt precious and fragile in Pearl's hands as they stood on the courthouse steps 2 weeks later, their legal business finally complete. The traveling photographer from Dodge City had captured something remarkable. 3 weathered faces, united not by blood but by choice, by shared struggle and mutual care that had transformed strangers into family. "Look at us," Franklin marveled, studying the image over his wife's shoulder. 3 months ago, I'd never laid eyes on Josiah Cordell. Now, he's legally my partner in everything we own. The paperwork had been completed that morning, deed modification, partnership agreement, all the legal documents that made their unconventional family arrangement official in the eyes of Kansas law. Josiah Cordell was now equal owner of the Brewster homestead, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. "How does it feel?" Pearl asked him as they climbed into their wagon for the journey home. "Being tied down to one place after 3 years of wandering?" Josiah settled the reins in his hands, his dark eyes thoughtful as he considered her question. "Like coming home to a place I never knew I was looking for," he said finally. "Like finding out that family doesn't have to be something you're born into, it can be something you build." The ride back to their homestead passed in comfortable conversation about spring plans and future improvements. The crisis that had brought them to this moment seemed almost distant now, overshadowed by the reality of what they'd accomplished together. Not just the legal partnership, but the deeper bonds that made the legal arrangement meaningful. As their cabin came into view across the snow-covered prairie, Pearl felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with property ownership or financial security. They'd taken the wreckage left by a tornado and built something better than what had been destroyed, not just a house, but a home that could shelter love as well as bodies. "There it is," Franklin said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our place, all of ours now, legal and proper." They'd invited Henderson and Miller families to witness their homecoming, to see the completion of what had begun as a simple act of kindness and grown into something that challenged every assumption about what family could be. As they approached the cabin, Pearl could see neighbors gathering not to gossip or judge, but to celebrate with them. Martha Henderson emerged from the cabin carrying a pot of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd witnessed a miracle. "Pearl Brewster, I've never seen anything like what you three have accomplished. When that tornado hit, I thought you were finished. Now look at you, stronger than ever, and with twice the family you started with." The impromptu celebration that followed felt like a wedding, a barn raising, and a homecoming all rolled into one. Their neighbors brought food and stories, sharing the warmth of community acceptance that meant more than any legal document could provide. "Speech!" called out Tom Miller, raising his cup of coffee in salute. "Let's hear from our new family about what they're planning for spring." Franklin stood slowly, his weathered face reflecting the weight of everything they'd been through and everything they'd gained. 3 months ago, Pearl and I stood in the ruins of everything we'd built in 43 years of marriage. We thought our story was ending. He paused, looking at Josiah and Pearl with an expression of wonder that seemed to surprise even him. "Turns out our story was just beginning a new chapter. We learned that family isn't just about blood or marriage vows. It's about people who choose to take care of each other, who choose to build something together that none of them could manage alone." Pearl felt tears spring to her eyes as her husband continued. "Josiah didn't just save our homestead with his gold. He saved our faith in what family could mean. And we didn't just give him a place to stay. We gave him what he'd been looking for without knowing it. A place to belong, people who needed him as much as he needed us." The applause that followed was gentle but heartfelt, the kind of acknowledgement that prairie communities reserved for achievements that mattered more than money or conventional success. As the sun set over their gathered neighbors, Pearl found herself standing beside the window where she'd placed that first candle on the night they'd moved into their winter cabin. The light that had symbolized new beginnings now illuminated faces that had become dear, voices that had become necessary parts of her daily life. "Josiah," she said quietly, drawing him aside as the celebration continued around them. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your freedom, your ability to just walk away when things get difficult?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the scene of their neighbors sharing food and conversation in the home they'd built together. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty she'd never heard from him before. "Pearl, I spent 3 years thinking freedom meant having nothing to lose. Turns out real freedom is having something worth staying for, something worth protecting and building and investing your whole heart in." He paused, touching his coat pocket where the damaged photograph of Catherine and Anna still rested. "They'd be happy for me, I think. Happy that I finally stopped running from love and decided to run toward it instead." As if summoned by some unspoken signal, Franklin joined them at the window, completing their circle of 3. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the winter grass with its eternal song. But inside their carefully built walls, 3 souls who'd learned to trust again settled into the warmth they'd created together. The photograph in Pearl's hands captured more than their faces. It captured the moment when strangers became family, when loss became love, when 3 damaged hearts learned to beat as one. 6 months later, as spring painted the Kansas prairie with wildflowers and new grass, 3 rocking chairs sat on the front porch of the house that had risen from the ashes of the old. Pearl settled into the middle chair, the one Josiah had crafted especially for her, with arms positioned perfectly for her quilting and a back curved to support long evenings of watching the sunset paint the sky. The chairs were more than furniture. They were symbols of permanence, of the quiet confidence that came with knowing this porch would shelter their conversations for years to come. Josiah had carved them from oak salvaged from their original house, wood that had weathered 40 years of prairie storms and somehow emerged stronger for the experience. "Never thought I'd see the day," Franklin mused, rocking gently as he watched their new barn take shape in the distance. The structure was larger than the original, designed with Josiah's mountain engineering and Franklin's prairie practicality. 6 months ago, we were living in a lean-to and wondering if we'd survive the winter. Now look at this place. Pearl followed his gaze across their homestead, seeing it with the satisfaction of someone who'd participated in its resurrection. The new house stood proud and solid, built to withstand anything the Kansas weather could throw at it. The garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables and the simple pleasure of watching things grow. The livestock pens housed cattle and chickens that represented not just sustenance but prosperity. "Feels like a different lifetime," she agreed. "Sometimes I can barely remember what it felt like to think our story was ending." Josiah emerged from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and sawdust in his hair from the morning's work on grain bins. At 52, he moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world, who no longer carried the weight of wondering where he belonged. "Robert's coming next week," Pearl announced as Josiah climbed the porch steps and settled into his own chair. "Telegraph came this morning. Says he wants to see how we're managing our situation." Franklin's expression darkened slightly. Despite their reconciliation over the mortgage crisis, relations with their son remained strained. Robert had never quite forgiven them for solving their problems without his help, and he'd never quite accepted Josiah's place in their lives. "He can see for himself that we're managing just fine," Franklin said with the quiet dignity that had carried him through 43 years of prairie farming. "Better than fine, truth be told. Sarah's coming too," Pearl continued, "with the grandchildren. She wants them to meet their Uncle Josiah properly." The title had evolved naturally over the winter months, a way for the extended family to understand Josiah's place in their lives without requiring lengthy explanations. To the children, he was simply Uncle Josiah, the man who'd helped rebuild Grandpa and Grandma's house, who told stories about mountain life and carved wooden toys with patient skill. "Uncle Josiah," Franklin repeated with amusement. "Never thought I'd have a brother at my age, especially one I chose rather than inherited." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Henderson wagon, bringing Martha with a basket of fresh bread and the latest news from town. The visit had become a weekly tradition, part of the social fabric that connected their homestead to the wider community. "How's the new preacher working out?" Pearl asked as Martha settled herself on the porch steps. "Oh, he's a good man, Martha," replied. Young, but earnest, been asking about your situation not in a judgmental way. Mind you, says he's never seen anything like what you three have built together. Wants to use your story in a sermon about the many forms that Christian love can take. Pearl felt a warm glow of pride at the acceptance they'd earned. It hadn't been easy. Small communities were naturally suspicious of unconventional arrangements. But their obvious contentment, their contributions to local activities, and their simple integrity had gradually won over even the most conservative neighbors. Tell him he's welcome to visit any time, Josiah said. Always room at our table for someone who understands that family comes in all shapes and sizes. As afternoon melted toward evening, the conversation turned to future plans. Next year, they hoped to expand their wheat acreage. Josiah was designing a new windmill that would improve their water access. Pearl wanted to establish an orchard on the south slope, fruit trees that would provide shade and sustenance for decades to come. 40 years from now, Franklin said thoughtfully, these chairs will still be here. Maybe our grandchildren will sit in them, watching their own children play in that yard. And maybe some lonely traveler will ride up one day, needing help the way Josiah did, Pearl added. Maybe we'll have the chance to pass on what we learned about opening your heart to strangers. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that rivaled any church window, the three of them settled into the comfortable silence of people who'd learned they could trust the future because they'd built it together. The tornado that had destroyed their old life seemed like a blessing now, a violent wind that had swept away everything superficial and left only what truly mattered. They'd lost a house, but found a family. They'd lost security, but found something more valuable, the knowledge that love could be chosen as surely as it could be inherited. Josiah reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the damaged photograph of Catherine and Anna, the image that had traveled with him through 3 years of mountain wandering. The crack that ran through Catherine's face had been carefully mended with gold wire, Japanese style, making the damage part of the beauty rather than hiding it. Time to let them rest, he said softly, looking at the faces of the family he'd lost. They brought me this far, but I think they'd want me to live for the family I have now. Pearl watched as he kissed the photograph gently and placed it in the small wooden box where they kept their most precious meanings, land deeds, family Bibles, the partnership agreement that made their chosen family legal. As darkness settled over the prairie, bringing with it the first stars and the eternal song of wind through grass, 3 rocking chairs creaked in gentle rhythm on a porch built last. Inside the house, lamps glowed warmly in windows that would welcome whatever travelers the future might bring. They'd learned that home wasn't just a place, it was people who chose to love each other through whatever storms might come.